Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Ready to unpack something kind of big today?
Always up for a challenge. What are we diving into?
Well, today we're going to explore how we actually create our own personal narratives.
Okay.
You know those stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how we think the world works?
Oh, yeah, I get.
And to help us unpack all of this, we are going to be pulling from Eastern philosophy and Western psychology.
Cool.
So we've got some excerpts from a book here that's really got me thinking about everything.
Yeah.
And it's really making me question, like, everything I thought I knew about myself.
It's wild how much we just kind of operate on autopilot, right?
Totally.
We were just going through life reacting to all these situations.
Yeah.
But how often do we actually stop and examine the beliefs that are driving those reactions?
No, you're totally right. And this book really, like, dives headfirst into all of that.
Okay.
And it starts with these two super powerful Sanskrit words,
Okay.
dukkha and sukha.
All right.
And I know Sanskrit can sound a little intimidating,
Right.
but trust me, these concepts are so relatable.
Okay.
So dukkha is often translated as suffering,
Right.
but it's actually a lot broader than that.
Right.
It's more like a feeling of unease, or that feeling you get when things just feel off.
Yeah.
Like, think about the last time you were stuck in traffic,
Yeah.
stressing about all those deadlines.
Yeah.
That's dukkha creeping in.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. What's interesting is that Buddhism doesn't try to like erase dukkha.
Okay.
It acknowledges that discomfort is just a natural part of life. Instead, it focuses more on transforming our relationship with discomfort.
Okay.
And that is where sukha comes in.
Oh, okay.
That feeling of well-being, contentment, maybe even bliss.
So it's not about pretending that, like, the tough stuff isn't there.
Right.
It's more about learning to move through it in a way that leads to more peace.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the book actually breaks dukkha down even further
Okay.
into 3 different types.
Okay.
It's not just about stubbing your toe.
Okay.
There's dukkha,
Okay.
which is like the direct experience of pain.
Okay.
It could be physical or emotional.
Gotcha.
Then there's viparinamadukkha,
Okay.
which is more about the discomfort that comes with change.
Okay.
And this is interesting because even positive change can come with some unease.
Right.
Like, say you get a promotion. That's exciting, but it can also be a little bit scary.
Oh, totally. New job, new responsibilities, maybe even a new city.
Exactly.
Exciting, but also kind of scary.
Exactly. Our instinct is to kind of cling to what's familiar,
Right.
even if it's not actually serving us.
Totally.
And there's the third type,
Okay.
samkara dukkha.
Samkara dukkha.
And this is the suffering that we create with our minds.
So this is where we can really, like, spiral with our thoughts.
Precisely, imagine you get into like an argument with your partner.
Okay.
The initial hurt feelings,
Yeah.
that's dukkha.
Okay.
And then the stress of trying to figure out how to repair that relationship,
Right.
that's viparinamadukkha.
Okay.
But then we start replaying that argument in our heads, right?
Yeah.
We're adding our own interpretations and judgments, maybe even blaming ourselves or the other person.
Oh, yeah.
That's samkara dukkha in action.
It's like we take a difficult situation and then our minds make it 10 times worse.
Yes, and this is where the book draws a really fascinating parallel between Eastern philosophy and Western neuroscience.
Okay.
You've probably heard of phantom limb syndrome, right?
Yeah, where someone loses a limb, but they can still feel even pain where that limb used to be.
Exactly, and scientists believe this happens because our brains are trying to make sense of conflicting information.
Okay.
It's still wired for that limb to be there,
Right.
so it creates this experience of sensation,
Wow.
even though the physical limb is gone.
Okay.
And the book argues that our sense of self can actually work in a similar way.
So you're saying our brains are creating a kind of phantom self.
It's an interesting concept.
So we have this idea of who we are, but it might not entirely be based in reality.
It's a fascinating concept, right?
Yeah.
And to really understand it, we've got to dig into these different layers of self.
Okay.
Atman, Jiva, Ahamkara, and Asmita.
Okay.
Don't worry, we'll unpack all of those.
Yeah.
But the main takeaway here is that our sense of self isn't this like fixed, unchanging thing.
Right.
It's constructed. It's
Yeah.
always evolving based on our experiences and our thoughts,
Right.
even our cultural conditioning.
It's like we're constantly writing and rewriting the story of who we are,
Yes.
but we're often doing it unconsciously.
Yes. And just like any good story,
Yeah.
our self-narratives have characters and plots.
Yeah.
And even recurring themes.
And just like with those phantom limb cases, sometimes the story we're telling ourselves
Yeah.
doesn't quite match up with reality.
Exactly. But the good news is
Okay.
that once we become aware of these narratives,
Yeah.
we can start to question them,
Okay.
challenge them, and ultimately rewrite them in a way that's more empowering and fulfilling.
Okay, I am hooked. So where do we even begin? How do we untangle these different layers of self and understand these stories we're telling ourselves?
Well, it all starts by becoming aware of the two forces that are constantly shaping our reality, Nama and Rupa. Imagine water for a moment.
Yeah.
So Nama and Rupa are key to understanding how we experience the world. Think of water for a second. It could be ice or liquid or even vapor, right?
Right, it's all still H2O, just
Yep.
in different forms.
Yeah, exactly. And that's Rupa. It's those physical forms that things take in the world, always changing based on conditions. But then our concept of water, the word itself, that's Nama.
Okay.
It's like the label, the idea, the meaning that we're attaching to that always shifting Rupa.
So even if like my life is constantly changing, my mind is trying to create this solid self, like a fixed me narrative.
Yes. And that's where things can get a bit tricky
Mm.
because we crave that stability.
Right.
So we cling to these fixed ideas about ourselves, about other people, about how we think life should be. The book actually calls this clinging to our narratives.
Which brings us right back to dukkha, right?
Yeah.
Because when those fixed ideas butt up against, the changing reality of life, that's when we experience suffering.
You got it. And it's not even just those external circumstances. This clinging also happens in our own minds. And the book points to those four layers of self we were talking about earlier, Atman, Jiva, Ahamkara, and Asmita.
Okay, yeah. We definitely need to unpack all of those. Where do we even begin?
Let's start with Atman, and this is where things get a little philosophical. Atman is often translated as the true self, or even the soul. But it's not something you can just easily pinpoint. Think of it more like that underlying unchanging essence that exists beyond all the labels and roles that we take on in life.
So kind of like the background hum of existence that's always there, even when our thoughts are racing a mile a minute.
Exactly. Now, Jiva is a bit easier to grasp. This is that instinctive, primal part of ourselves that's driven by survival and, pleasure seeking. It's the me that gets hungry, that seeks connection and wants to avoid pain.
Okay, so it's like our fight or flight response, but also like those simple joys and desires that we experience as humans.
Absolutely. Now, things get really interesting when we get to Ahamkara. This is often translated as ego, but it's much more nuanced than that.
So it's not just about like being selfish or self-centered.
Exactly. It's more about that sense of individuality, that feeling of I that separates us from everything else. It's the part of us that thinks, that plans, that makes decisions, and yes, tells those stories.
So Ahamkara is kind of like the one who is crafting those personal narratives we keep talking about.
You're spot on. It's constantly taking in information from our experiences and then weaving it into a coherent sense of self.
Okay.
And this is where Asmita comes in.
Okay.
It's the emotional attachment that we have to that Ahamkara creates.
Okay, so if I'm like really attached to the story of being successful and then I have a setback at work,
Yeah,
my Asmita is going to make me feel that blow extra hard.
exactly. It's that clinging to a particular image of ourselves, even when it might not actually be serving us. And this clinging is at the root of a lot of our suffering.
So how do we break free from the cycle of clinging and suffering? Do we just like try to shut down our Ahamkara and Asmita altogether?
That's where things get a little tricky, because these are natural parts of what it means to be human. We need Ahamkara to function in the world, to make choices, pursue goals. And Asmita, while it can cause suffering, also gives us a sense of identity, a sense of purpose.
Okay, so it's not about erasing these parts of ourselves. It's more about like becoming more aware of them and how
Yeah.
they're influencing us, how they influence our thoughts and our feelings and our actions.
Precisely. And that is where understanding the structure of our personal narratives becomes crucial.
Okay, let's talk about the structure of our stories then, because it's not like we just experience life as this random jumble of events, right? We try to find patterns, we try to make sense of things.
Exactly. And one of the key ways that we do that is through what the book calls linear narratives. It's that classic story structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
We create narratives about our past, about our present, about our future.
Right.
And these narratives, they can be helpful, like, giving our lives a sense of order, a sense of purpose.
But they can also like trap us in these limiting beliefs.
You said it. We might cling to this narrative of not being good enough based on something that happened a long time ago, even if it doesn't reflect who we are today.
Or we might have this fixed idea of how our life should go.
Right.
And that can lead to disappointment and frustration when things don't go according to plan.
Absolutely. And that's where the book introduces this concept of nonlinear narratives. Think of like a movie that jumps around in time or a story that's told from lots of different perspectives.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. Life is rarely a straight line. There are twists and turns and unexpected events, moments where we have to completely rewrite the script.
Exactly. And the more that we can embrace that nonlinearity, the more flexible we become, the more adaptable we become in the face of life's challenges. Because when we're too rigidly attached to those linear narratives, we miss out on the present moment. We miss out on all the richness, the complexity.
Like we're so busy trying to make our lives fit into this predetermined box that we forget to actually experience life as it unfolds.
Exactly.
So how do we start to loosen the grip of these linear narratives and embrace a more nonlinear way of being? Because let's be real, it's one thing to, understand these concepts in our heads, but it's a whole other thing to actually live them.
You're hitting the nail on the head. It's not enough to just talk about this stuff. We have to apply it.
Yeah.
We have to experiment. We have to see how it lands for us in our own lives. And that is where the concept of Abhyasa Vichara comes in.
All right, we are back. So we've made it to the grand finale, and I've got to say, this deep dive has been pretty intense.
It's a lot to take in, right?
It really is.
Yeah.
So far, we've deconstructed the whole idea of self.
Right.
We've explored how our minds cling to these narratives.
Yeah.
And we even dipped our toes into the differences between, linear and nonlinear experiences.
Yeah.
So now for the big question, how do we actually live this stuff?
Right. That's the million-dollar question. And it's all about bringing these concepts down from our heads
Yeah.
and into our everyday experience.
Right.
So remember Abhyasa Vichara from last time.
Yeah.
Practice and inquiry,
Yeah.
actively turning inward to investigate our own minds.
So less scrolling through social media and more scrolling through our thoughts and feelings.
You got it.
Easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. But that's where the practice part comes in.
Oh, okay.
It's like building a muscle. You wouldn't expect to run a marathon without any training, right?
Right. Yeah.
Same goes for understanding our minds.
Okay.
It takes consistent effort, but the rewards are enormous.
Okay. I'm game. What's the first step? What's the first rep in this mind workout?
One powerful practice the book talks about is becoming aware of our dominant narrative themes.
Okay.
Those stories we keep telling ourselves over and over again.
Yeah.
Are these stories of, not being good enough or always having to prove myself?
Yeah, those are some pretty common ones. And it's like those themes then become these lenses that color how we see everything in our lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they can be so ingrained that we don't even realize they're there. But once we start paying attention to those thoughts, our feelings, we can start to identify those recurring themes. It's like we're holding a mirror up to our own minds.
Okay.
It's like, okay, what's really going on here?
That holding up the mirror image is really powerful.
Yeah.
But let's be real. What happens when we look in that mirror and we don't like what we see?
Yeah.
I feel like that's where a lot of us, we get tripped up. We avoid it.
It's true. Those shadow parts of ourselves can be really tough to confront.
Yeah.
But that is where that inquiry part of Vidyasa Vichara becomes so important.
Okay.
Because it's about approaching those difficult emotions, those thought patterns, with a sense of curiosity rather than judgment.
Okay.
So instead of beating ourselves up for having those thoughts, we try to get curious about where they come from. What's this really about?
So less, I'm feeling insecure again, and more, I wonder why this situation is bringing up these feelings.
Exactly. When we can approach ourselves with that kind of open-hearted curiosity,
Yeah.
it just creates so much space for compassion, for understanding.
Yeah.
And it's from that space that real transformation can happen.
That's so true. This is making me think about all those different characters that we talked about.
Right.
The victim, the hero, the martyr. It's like those characters are the ones who are playing out all these dominant themes.
You've got it. And by becoming aware of those characters, we can start to choose different roles to play in our own lives.
Totally.
We don't have to be bound by those same old scripts.
We have the power to write a new story. Wow, this has been such an incredible journey.
It has.
From, understanding dukkha and sukha to uncovering the layers of self to rewriting our narratives. But I have a feeling this is just the beginning, right?
Absolutely. This is a lifelong practice.
Yeah.
And the more that we can cultivate self-awareness,
Yeah.
the more freedom we have, the more agency we have to create lives that are truly aligned with our values.
It's so true.
And our deepest aspirations. And remember, it's not about achieving some perfect state of no self.
Right.
Or never experiencing negative emotions again, right? life is messy.
Totally.
It's really about learning to dance with that full spectrum of human experience, with more presence, with wisdom, and with compassion.
I love that. Learning to dance with the full spectrum of human experience.
Yeah,
That feels so much more like liberating than trying to force ourselves into some, idealized version of reality.
I agree.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us for this incredible deep dive. And remember, the most important story you'll ever tell is the one you create